Hi, I'm Parisa. As I mentioned in the previous video, we would go through the whole AKS security concept for application and cluster. As the topic is really huge, in this video we would focus on cluster security with service principal or managed identity, and the whole implementation that you would see in demos is based on Terraform, but the CLI command will be provided as well. Only for information, security concept for application and cluster is the whole secure supply chain, including the build environment and even container registry. We will go through the whole workflow in this video series. The Azure services that we can use would be to have a better security, would be Active Directory, Microsoft Defender for Container, Azure Policy, Azure Kubelet, Network Security Group, and orchestrated cluster upgrades to run the latest OS security updates and release. All these topics and even more will be supported or covered during this video series. Only to give you an overview about the overview of topics that we would go through. We would go through all the items that I mentioned here and even more, but our focus in this video is about cluster security and exactly service principal and managed identity. The question is, which possibilities do we have for cluster security? We have, of course, several different possibilities. I have listed some of them, but I will focus on cluster access via service principal and managed identity in this video. And next video would be about image cleaner to clean up stale images. This list is not still completed because I'm providing or preparing the PowerPoints in parallel to provide the video. Therefore, the list can get longer, but I have some of them already here. AKS cluster needs access to other Azure resources. Why a cluster should need access to other Azure resources? Because cluster needs it to dynamically create or manage other Azure resources such as an Azure load balancer or to pull images from container registry. But how we can make it possible? We can make it possible, or we can give access to the cluster with using a service principal or managed identity. A managed identity can be system assigned or user assigned, and the default one is system assigned managed identity. Only to know more about cluster access to other Azure resources via using a service principal, it's important to know that the clusters using a service principal eventually expire, and the service principal must be renewed to keep the cluster working. Managing service principals add complexity, thus it is easier to use managed identities instead. And managed identities are recommended by Microsoft. The service principal is nothing but a client application which is registered in Azure Active Directory, and it has a client ID and a client secret, and a secret can be available for, I think, maximum 1 year, and then you should think about to renew it. It can have some operational overhead for the organization or the team, but we won't have this complexity with using or by using managed identity. I have provided the command line which we can use to create a cluster with using service principal. The service principal has client ID, which is the app ID, and a client secret, which is a password here. You can use it for your cluster if you want to create or provision it with service principal. The second way to give access to cluster, to be able to access to other Azure resources, is managed identity. Managed identity can be system assigned or user assigned. In the demo that I want to present to you later is based on user assigned. User assigned identity give me more flexibility because I create the identity before creating the cluster, and I can assign any RBAC or roles that I want to this user to be able to access other resources during AKS creation. But the difference between user assigned and system assigned is system assigned identity is available for us as a developer to assign, if we want to assign some customized RBAC to this identity when the cluster provisioning or creation is finished. During the creation, we cannot access to this identity. Therefore, it wasn't a good option or solution for me, only to know why I used user assigned. It's important to know managed identities use certificate-based authentication, and each managed identity's credential has an expiration of 90 days and it's rolled after 45 days. I have provided the command line here for creating AKS cluster as enable managed identity. In this case, a system managed identity will be used. It's important to know AKS will create a system assigned kubelet identity in the node resource group if you do not specify your own kubelet managed identity as above. In the previous video, I mentioned kubelet. To provide you more clarity, when you use command line, PowerShell, or Terraform, or any other tools to provide or provision, or create a cluster, you can provide a resource group name. This resource group name is the resource group where the cluster is provisioned into it. But a second resource group will be created automatically. You can provide the name of the second resource group via command line or via Terraform. The second resource group is the place where the additional resources are created. The node, they are exactly the node resource. For example, load balancer, as I mentioned here, public IP, VM scale set for our user pool, or for system pool, node pool. In the first resource group, in my scenario, in the same resource group as my cluster, I will create 2 additional managed identities as well. One of them is for AKS cluster, and the second one is for kubelet. They need different RBACs to be able to do their tasks. For example, the kubelet managed identity need ACR pool. It is Azure Container Registry Pool RBAC. To be able to pull an image from container registry and deploy, to be able to deploy it as a pod on cluster. The kubelet have to have virtual machine contributor RBAC as well to be able to create extra resources for me as well. The cluster identity user assigned will obtain a contributor role on the second resource group automatically. Because I want to use a user assigned identity for my managed identity for my kubelet, the cluster user assigned identity must have managed identity operator RBAC on the resource group where the kubelet user assigned identity has been created or provisioned. Therefore, I gave the managed identity for my cluster this RBAC, and you would see the same Terraform implementation as this diagram in the demo. As I already mentioned, if we only use the enable manage identity argument in our CLI, the system assigned manage identity will be used for control plane and kubelet. If we want to use user assigned manage identity for the control plane, we should provision this identity before using AKS create, and then use the assign identity argument to mention or specify what is the ID of the identity which we want to use for our cluster. And if you want to use a user assigned managed identity for kubelet as well, then we should use the second extra or additional argument in the command line assign kubelet identity to specify the user assigned managed identity ID. We can verify our job with using the command lines that I have provided here to check or to verify if the managed identity is used in our cluster creation. When you see in the response the client ID MSI, it means the cluster is using managed identity. And if you see the object ID in the response, then it means that the cluster is using service principal. We will use this command in our demo to check the response. I only listed the RBAC roles that I have used in my video. Sometimes it could be equivalent or relevant for you based on the scenario that you are developing, and you would see the implementation of this role assignments and the specific scope of the role assignment in my Terraform. The link of my Terraform implementation will be provided in the description of this video. All the implementation and their dependencies you can see or find in my GitHub repository. Therefore, you can refer directly to the source code to see the role name and the scope, because each RBAC need a role, a scope, and an identity. It means we say who has access or which role on which scope. I explained the whole scenario for the demo, and let's go for the demo. On the right side is the Visual Studio Code, on the left side is the Azure portal. I didn't provision my AKS cluster for demo to show you. easy to provision. I have the enterprise AKS implementation. It is my main implementation in my GitHub, and I refer to the other dependencies or child module that I would need during this demo. Some of them are listed here. You can use the same to provision the same configured cluster for yourself. I used the Terraform init upgrade, or you can use Terraform init, and because I use this command already, I will go ahead with Terraform apply. One more thing that you can change for yourself is the provider. For example, you can change this file based on your requirement. I configured it for myself. You can use the variable as well. I use the constant value because it is only for video purposes. And then I answer the question with yes. In the meantime that the cluster is getting created, I will go through the important part of this implementation. In the AKS implementation, it is my child module. I have defined the identity part for kubelet and for cluster. Identity is for cluster, and I say I want to use user assigned identity for my AKS cluster, and the ID is this. And I mentioned Kubelet Identity. I developed my code in a way to have flexibility, either to provide user-defined identity or let the system use the system identity, managed identity. Maybe it would be interesting for your project. I defined an identity kubelet. I can show you in my input. Kubelet identity, which is an object and contain the values that are relevant for my kubelet identity. And then I used one of them and said if it is null, then it means you can create a cluster with system assigned managed identity. And if I provide the client ID, it means I want that you create a cluster with user assigned managed identity for me. Then I go back to the main file here. The cluster module. In the cluster module, I have the identity for cluster and the identity for kubelet, which I have created them before creating the cluster. And you see that the name is provided by using another module because I didn't want to think about how should I call or name the resources. Therefore, I have a easy naming with a specific naming convention. Maybe it can be interesting for you. It is helpful for me. I don't think about the name of the resources. I let the module find or create a name, not define, but create a name based on naming conventions of Microsoft for me. And then you see that for creating a managed identity, I refer to another child module. You can find the child module, maybe important to know. Each child module has a tag which I refer to because I'm providing the videos, and based on the video it can be that I have to develop something new in my code. Therefore I use the tag to fix the changes that you are seeing right now in this video to be able to provide the same cluster with same configuration for you later. And the implementation of the managed identity is here. It's not too complex. It is only one resource. I provide a managed identity, and then I send back the ID of it, the principal of it. Sometimes in some Terraform file you would see object ID, sometimes principal ID. Both of them is this principal ID. And the client of the ID of the user-defined managed identity. I go back to the main module or the root module, and in the AKS module you see that I refer to the already created kubelet identity for this variable that I have defined. I think I presented you the most important part of this implementation. Of course, if you have any question, please write the comment under the video. I will go through the question and answer them. But right now I would pause the video and wait that the cluster is finished, and then I'll come back to check the or verify if the MSI or user defined managed identity is really used in our new created cluster or not. Okay, the cluster provisioning has been finished. We see some output information in my terminal here that nine resources has been created. If I look at my portal, we see that app repository has been created. It is the resource group where I create my cluster, the two managed identities or user assigned managed identities, and my my container registry. I go back to resource groups. This resource group is the resource group which has been created automatically for me or for a cluster for the resources that a cluster will need right now or in the future, and they will provisioned automatically by a cluster. And then you can see the resource group name for nodes here. I have even provided a node resource group attribute here because I wanted that the resource group for nodes even follow my naming convention. Right now let's verify if the cluster is using user-defined managed identity. Okay, I opened the Cloud Shell and provided the command line that I want to use. I paste it here. AKS, the command line is AKS AKS show resource group name and the cluster name query for service principal profile. Let's see. Exactly, it is client ID MSI. It means that a cluster has been configured to use user-defined managed identity. I hope this video could help you by provisioning your AKS cluster with using user-defined or user-assigned managed identity. The next topic would be AKS security concept for applications and cluster with a focus to clean up stale images by using image cleaner.